A single bullet, no return address. Delivered not to Bumpy Johnson, but to his mother's front door. The message was clear. Whoever sent it knew exactly where she lived, and they wanted Bumpy to know that too. What happened next would define the next 2 years of Harlem's underworld. Harlem in the early 1950s was not a place that operated without structure. Beneath the surface of its music halls, barbershops and street corners ran a parallel economy, governed by its own rules, its own hierarchies, and its own codes of conduct. Bumpy Johnson sat near the top of that structure, not by accident, but through a combination of calculated violence, political intelligence, and a reputation built over 2 decades of surviving things that had killed other men. By this period, Bumpy had already survived federal prison, a war with the Luciano organization, and multiple attempts on his life. He had emerged from each episode not weakened, but more entrenched. His control over Harlem's numbers racket was substantial. His relationships with both black community figures and Italian organized crime families gave him an unusual dual legitimacy that few men in his position ever managed to hold simultaneously. He was not a man who invited provocations. He did not need to perform power. Those who knew him understood that his restraint was not weakness. It was method. It arrived at the home of Bumpy's mother on a weekday morning. An ordinary envelope, hand-delivered, with no markings identifying the sender. Inside was a single bullet, unmistakably real, unmistakably intentional, and a folded letter. The bullet was not explained in the letter. It did not need to be. In the language of the streets, a bullet sent to a man's home meant one thing: we can reach what you love. The fact that it was sent not to Bumpy's own address, but to his mother's house, sharpened the message considerably. This was not a warning fired into the air. It was a warning placed directly at the feet of the one person Bumpy Johnson was known to hold above everything else. Whoever sent it understood the geography of his life well enough to know where she lived. That knowledge alone was its own form of threat. The letter that accompanied the bullet was not long. It did not need to be. It laid out in plain terms a demand, or depending on how one read it, an ultimatum. The specifics concerned territory, a particular operation in Upper Harlem that the sender believed Bumpy was encroaching upon, or that the sender intended to claim regardless of who currently held it. The tone was not that of a man asking. It was the tone of a man who believed he had already decided the outcome and was extending the courtesy of advance notice. Those who were present in the room when Bumpy read it later described the same thing. Silence. Not the silence of a man processing shock, but the silence of a man who had already understood the situation before he finished the first paragraph. He read the letter in full. He did not skim it. He did not pass it to anyone else in the room. He read it the way a man reads a legal document, carefully, completely, without visible reaction. When he finished, he folded it once along its original crease. He set it on the table in front of him. He did not speak immediately. The people in that room, men who had been around Bumpy long enough to read his moods, understood that the absence of anger was not the absence of consequence. They had seen him angry. This was not that. What they were watching was something more deliberate. A man sorting through options not out of uncertainty, but out of precision. He was not deciding whether to respond. He was deciding exactly how. He picked up the phone. The call lasted less than 4 minutes. No one in the room heard the other side of the conversation. What they heard from Bumpy was measured, a name spoken once, a location referenced briefly, a time given, nothing repeated, no raised voice. When he set the receiver down, he did not offer an explanation to the men around him. He picked up the letter, folded it a second time, and placed it in his jacket pocket. The person he called was not a street-level enforcer. That detail matters. Bumpy Johnson, in moments that required a specific kind of resolution, did not reach for the nearest available instrument. He reached for the right one. The man on the other end of that call occupied a particular position in Harlem's operational structure, someone whose involvement did not signal a brawl, but a closing. When word moved through the right channels that this individual had been contacted, it communicated something to those who understood the network. This was not a dispute that was going to be argued. It was a dispute that was going to be ended. One call was sufficient because of what the call represented, not merely what was said in it. Bumpy's network was not built on volume. It was built on precision. Each connection he maintained served a specific function, and he had spent years ensuring that when a function was needed, the right person was already in place. The infrastructure had been built long before the envelope arrived. The call was simply the activation of something that already existed. By the time he stood up from the table, the machinery was already in motion. The man behind the envelope was not an outsider to Harlem. That was part of what made the act so notable. This was not someone from a rival borough testing the borders of Bumpy's territory from a distance. This was a figure with operational roots in Upper Harlem, someone who had been functioning within the same geography, the same economy, for long enough to know the lay of it. He ran a numbers sub-operation that had, for a period, operated without direct conflict with Bumpy's interests. Whether that coexistence had been maintained through deliberate avoidance or through Bumpy's tolerance was a matter of interpretation. What changed was ambition. In the years following World War II, Harlem's underground economy expanded alongside the neighborhood itself. The numbers racket, in particular, generated consistent revenue, and that consistency attracted men who had previously been content with smaller shares. This individual had grown his operation steadily, quietly, and had at some point concluded that the next step required displacing someone above him rather than expanding laterally. Targeting Bumpy Johnson's mother was not an impulsive decision. It required knowing where she lived, which required surveillance or inside information. It required the willingness to cross a line that most men in that world, even rivals, even enemies, treated as absolute. Whether he believed the act would intimidate Bumpy into concession, or whether he calculated that the spectacle of it would attract others willing to move against Bumpy at the same time, the underlying assumption was the same, that Bumpy Johnson could be pressured through the people he loved. That assumption was the miscalculation. Bumpy Johnson was born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1905. His mother, Minnie, had brought the family north to Harlem during the Great Migration, as hundreds of thousands of black families did in those decades, seeking work, stability, and distance from the explicit violence of the Jim Crow South. She was, by all accounts, a woman of strong religious conviction and firm personal standards, qualities that existed in direct contrast to the life her son came to lead, and which she never abandoned regardless of what that life produced. Bumpy's relationship with his mother was one of the few constants in a life defined by turbulence. He maintained her household. He ensured she was not drawn into the operational side of his world. The address where she lived was not a secret to those close to him, but it functioned by unspoken agreement among the people who moved through his circles, as off-limits, not because anyone had been told this explicitly, but because the logic of it was understood. Bumpy Johnson's mother was the one domain he held entirely apart from everything else. To use her as leverage was to announce that you either did not know this or did not care. Neither interpretation served the sender well. When Minnie Johnson was informed of what had arrived at her door, she did not, by the accounts that filtered through those who knew the family, respond with panic. She was not a woman who frightened easily, but what it meant, what it said about the world her son inhabited, and how far into her own quiet life that world was willing to reach, was not lost on her. Word traveled through Harlem the way it always did, not through announcements, but through the network of men and women who occupied the corners, the barber shops, the card rooms, and the numbers drops that formed the connective tissue of the neighborhoods underground. By the following day, the broad outline of what had happened was known among those who paid attention to such things. An envelope had been sent to Bumpy Johnson's mother, Bumpy had read it. He had made a phone call. He had not said anything further. That last part, the silence, was what generated the most concern among those who understood his patterns. Men who had operated in proximity to Bumpy over the years knew the distinction between his different modes of response. A visible reaction, a public confrontation, an announced grievance, was manageable. It had edges, a shape, a timeline. What he was doing now had none of those qualities. It was contained entirely within a single phone call and a folded letter in his jacket. For the people who understood what that meant, the days following the envelope's arrival carried a specific kind of tension, not the tension of waiting for something to explode, but the tension of knowing that something was already in motion and that it would resolve itself on Bumpy's timeline, not anyone else's. Several figures who had maintained a degree of proximity to the sender quietly created distance in those days, not dramatically, not with any public statement, but in the small practical ways that men in that world used to protect themselves from proximity to a failing position. Meetings were missed. Messages went unreturned. The sender, whether or not he recognized what this signaled, was being left to stand alone. What Bumpy Johnson set in motion after that phone call was not visible to most of Harlem. That was by design. He did not move in straight lines. He did not send men to deliver counter-threats or stage public confrontations that would draw attention from the wrong quarters. The NYPD's attention was a constant variable in everything he did, and one of the disciplines that had kept him operational through multiple federal investigations was the practice of conducting serious business without providing obvious evidence of it. What moved instead were relationships. Specific conversations happened between specific people over the following 2 weeks, arrangements that the sender had relied upon, supply lines, protection understandings, the quiet agreements that kept a numbers operation running without interference, began to develop complications, not catastrophic failures, not immediately, but the kind of friction that requires a man's full attention, the kind that, if he is paying attention, tells him that the ground beneath his operation is no longer stable. Simultaneously, the personnel the sender depended on began receiving offers, not aggressive recruitment, simply the quiet communication that there were other arrangements available, should they be interested. Several accepted, several more declined, but understood the message in the offer itself. Bumpy did not appear at any of these junctures personally. He did not need to. The network he had spent years constructing operated with enough internal logic that his presence was not required for each individual action. He had set a direction. The people he trusted carried it out with the understanding that precision and patience were the requirements. Not speed, not spectacle. Within 6 weeks of the envelope's delivery, the operation that the sender had built over years was functionally dismantled, not through a single dramatic event, but through a sequence of compounding losses that left it without the infrastructure needed to function. His runners had been absorbed by other operations, or had simply stopped showing up. His protection arrangements had been quietly voided by the people who had originally offered them. The revenue streams he depended upon had been redirected. He was not, in the immediate term, killed. That detail is worth noting because it speaks to Bumpy's methodology. Death was available as a resolution. It was not always the preferred one. A man who is dead becomes, in certain contexts, a problem. It attracts investigation. It creates narratives. It sometimes generates sympathy among people who might otherwise remain neutral. A man whose operation has been dismantled piece by piece, who has been left standing in a neighborhood where everyone understands what happened to him, communicates something different. He becomes a demonstration. What happened to the sender in the months that followed was the experience of irrelevance. The operation was gone. The relationships were gone. The standing that had made him a figure worth reckoning with had been methodically removed. He continued to exist in Harlem, but as a man who had made a specific kind of mistake and survived it in the most diminished sense of the word. His name, in the conversations that mattered, was no longer spoken in connection with power. It was spoken, when it was spoken at all, in connection with the story of what Bumpy Johnson had done in response to a bullet in an envelope. The incident did not require public announcement to produce public effect. Within Harlem's underground, the outcome was understood clearly and discussed with the specificity that men in that world applied to lessons worth retaining. What Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated was not simply that he could dismantle a rival's operation. That capacity had already been established through earlier episodes. What this particular incident demonstrated was the boundary around his personal life and the cost of crossing it. From that point forward, the unspoken rule that his family existed outside the logic of street conflict was no longer merely a matter of social assumption. It had been tested, and the test had produced a result. That result became part of the institutional knowledge of how Harlem's underworld operated around Bumpy Johnson. Future rivals, future provocateurs, future men with ambitions that brought them into conflict with his interests. They operated with the awareness of what had happened to the man who sent the envelope. The effect on how he was approached changed in a specific way. Men who had legitimate grievances against him, men who believed they had valid territorial or financial claims, continued to pursue those claims through the channels available to them. But the category of action that involved targeting anyone connected to his personal life, his family, his household, the spaces he kept apart from business, that category effectively closed, not because men in that world were incapable of ruthlessness, but because the calculation no longer made sense. The cost had been demonstrated. The return was zero. Bumpy Johnson's response to the envelope is studied, in the informal sense that people who were present in that world studied things, not because of what it achieved tactically, but because of what it revealed about how he thought. The tactical outcome was the dismantling of one man's operation that was finite, bounded, replaceable in the larger scope of Harlem's economy. What was not replaceable was the signal it sent about the distance between provoking Bumpy Johnson and provoking Bumpy Johnson through the people he loved. The distinction between a man who reacts and a man who responds is not merely temperamental. It is strategic. A reaction is generated by the provocation. It is proportional to the emotional impact of the event, and it is therefore predictable. A man who reacts can be manipulated through his reactions. A response is generated by an assessment of what outcome is required and what method will produce it most effectively. It is not constrained by the emotional weight of the trigger. Bumpy Johnson's 4-minute phone call was a response, not a reaction. The letter had been read. The situation had been activated. The emotion, whatever it was, did not alter the method. This is what separated him from the many other men who occupied positions of power in Harlem's underworld during those decades, and why his name retained its weight long after the specific episodes that built it had passed. Ed, from immediate memory. He was not the most violent man in that world. He was not the wealthiest, nor the most politically connected, nor the most feared in the conventional sense. What he was, consistently, and over a long career, was the most deliberate. The envelope that arrived at his mother's house was meant to destabilize him. What it produced instead was a demonstration of exactly the quality that made him difficult to destabilize. The capacity to absorb a serious provocation and respond to it with more precision than the person who delivered it had ever applied to anything. The envelope was meant to shake him. It did the opposite. Bumpy Johnson never raised his voice, never made a public move, and never explained himself. He folded the letter, made one call, and waited. In Harlem, that kind of silence was the loudest message of all.